All right, so welcome back to class. Hope you are doing well. And this is our first screencast for week number 3, and we're looking at Chapter 7, Theories of Adjustment and Adaptation to Disability. So last week we discussed some of the final project and screencast things that you're going to be working on. So these are the major assignments. The quote-unquote minor assignments are your weekly homework and your forum posts. What we're trying to do in this class is to appreciate that the individual with a chronic illness and or disability experiences challenges to their psychology. There is an impact to that individual. Now, usually we are not psychological professionals, but we will use psychologically informed care within our practice. The whole purpose of this class is just to become better informed about some of the things that psychological professionals the things that they think about, the things that they worry about, the things that they work on with individuals with CID. So we're basically going to be throughout the term having an exploration of different topics, kind of going chapter by chapter. This is not to prepare us to become psychologists or to necessarily change our practice. It may inform our practice, it may help your practice, it may help your future research if you are pursuing an academic position. But I think it becomes important and helps us become more rounded in our care of the individual. So if you're a physical therapist, you're not just thinking about treating that knee, you're understanding how that knee injury impacts an individual at the personal level, how it impacts them environmentally, and that we understand and look for the verbal and nonverbal cues, and we listen to our patient because they may need support in ways that we're not used to providing support to them in, or we may need to provide them support via a referral to help them with their full recovery or their optimal recovery. So again, chapter by chapter, we're going to be looking at different things related to psychological or psychosocial care for individuals with chronic injury and or disability. So in this chapter, we're looking at adjustment and adaptation. Now, the authors of the chapter, they highlight that adjustment, adaptation, reaction, and response, these are used interchangeably, these terms, despite the fact that they may be different concepts and they may have some overlapping definitions. When used, they essentially refer to individuals with disabilities in their attempts to come to terms with their disability. Terms like adjustment and adaptation have a temporal or time component to them. In other words, one would typically need to be adapting before he or she can reach the final adjustment. A couple of researchers have described psychosocial adaptation as an evolving, dynamic, general process through which the individual gradually approaches an optimal state of person-environment congruence manifested by 1. Active participation in social, vocational, and avocational pursuits. 2. Successful negotiation of the physical environment. And 3. Awareness of remaining strengths and assets as well as existing functional limitations. The concept of adjustment is defined as a particular phase, for example, a set of experiences and reactions, of the psychosocial adaptation process. As such, adjustment is the clinically and phenomenologically hypothesized final phase, elusive as it may be, of the unfolding process of adaptation to crisis situations, including the onset of chronic illness and disability. It is alternatively expressed by terms such as 1. Reaching and maintaining psychosocial equilibrium. 2. achieving a state of reintegration. 3, positively striving to reach life goals. 4, demonstrating positive self-esteem, self-concept, self-regard, and the like. And 5, experiencing positive attitudes toward oneself, others, and the disability. There are several common theories of adaptation, these related to traumatic physical disability. Or I should say, there are 7 common theories of adaptation, and within this chapter, we will explore them in relation to traumatic physical disability. We aren't going to explore all of them. We're going to explore some of them in this screencast, some of the topics related to adaptation. And if you have additional interest, you should then read chapter 7. Remember, for your screencasts and final project, you're going to be kind of expanding upon concepts and areas that we discuss. And so this is, again, kind of giving you an overview of different things to see where your interests may potentially lie. So there is a lot of conceptual and empirical literature regarding adjustment or adaptation to an acquired disability. Far less has been done for those who've had a congenital disability or a disability that occurred from birth. Some researchers anecdotally believe that as individuals born with a disability have no pre-disability background to compare with or a loss of function to grieve, they generally do not have any apparent difficulties in adjusting. But the research literature is inconsistent in these findings. And why do you think that might be? Well, potentially, I would suspect that if somebody could compare themselves to others, that would be potentially a way that an individual with a congenital disability would have a threat to their psychology. Take, for example, a boy that played soccer with my oldest son for many years. He had a disability in that one of his upper extremities was damaged in utero. And so he was born with an upper extremity that was not functional. Very talented soccer player, though. However, he would wear clothing that would essentially hide his upper extremity. Could that have been a response for him, an awareness, a consciousness about his disability and him being different than others? Now, from a psychosocial development standpoint, theoretically, we generally pass through a number of critical life stages in development. The work that's been done in this area has not or did not take into account individuals with disability or congenital disability. So that challenged or that challenges our understanding. So the textbook provides some additional information looking at happiness in individuals born with congenital disabilities. Research is mixed, but generally positive for individuals. Overall, persons born with a disability are statistically at a greater risk of substance abuse problems, twice as likely to drop out of school, and more likely to be living in poverty than children without disabilities. Research indicates that family and community support are critical, and the positive psychosocial development of children and adolescents. When family cohesion, stability, and nurturing are dysfunctional, the likelihood increases for children to grow up with greater levels of adjustment problems. In addition, the person-environment interaction has time and again in numerous studies proved to be critical regarding individual self-concept and adaptation to disability. Give you another kind of interesting example of somebody born with a congenital disability, a patient of mine, and I don't think I've mentioned that patient yet in this class. This individual, I was working with her maybe 14, 15 years ago, and we had a long hallway leading from the front office into the clinic space. And she was sent back, and I was meeting her in the hallway, and I was watching her walk, and the diagnosis was something like a hamstring strain initially, but the way she was walking, I was certain that she had a knee injury, significant knee injury, because it just looked like she had instability and she was using some sort of compensatory strategy to be able to ambulate. Well, as I started doing the exam, she did not fit any clinical picture of a hamstring strain or knee instability. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. We ended up getting her to see the physical medicine and rehabilitation doctor that was associated with our clinic, that was right next door in the hospital. And she was basically diagnosed with muscular dystrophy for the first time in her life in her 40s. In her 40s. Pretty amazing. She was a successful individual, had a couple businesses, rode horses, believe it or not, and had no idea that she had this condition. Why? Well, this gets into how individuals are treated and how they are loved and cared for. Now, this individual was adopted at a very young age by a family who practiced Christian Science. And so, for those unfamiliar with that belief system, they rarely, if ever, use doctors. So she was told that she was one of God's special creations. So she received love, did not get medical attention or medicalized, and made it through life up to that point and appeared to be very successful. And it was just kind of an amazing story. Now let's do an overview of theories of adjustment and adaptation to acquired disabilities. Some models of adjustment, adaptation, or reaction have stronger evidence-based empirical support, while others are supported by clinical observation or qualitative self-report methods. Successful versus unsuccessful adjustment was initially conceptualized within a coping versus succumbing framework. Essentially, researchers theorized that successful coping involved assisting clients to recognize what they functionally could do as opposed to dwelling on what they could no longer do, emphasizing personal accomplishments, taking direct control of one's life, successfully negotiating physical and social access barriers, enjoying and expanding on social activities that one enjoys, and appropriately dealing with negative life experiences. Conversely, poor adjustment was described as succumbing to one's disability by dwelling on the past, focusing on one's limitations rather than assets, and passively accepting the disabled role as defined by society. So let's talk about stage models. Livney, 1986 and 1991, provides a succinct summary and synthesis of more than 40 explicit and implicit stage models of adjustment, described as a reaction to sudden and unexpected permanent physical disabling conditions. The variations of this model range in theory from 3 to 10 stages, but most commonly have 4 to 6 stages. Livnay cites several authors regarding a number of shared assumptions or rules of thumb applicable to these models. Several of the more pertinent assumptions are: 1. Adjustment is not a static but rather a dynamic, ongoing process, despite the concept that adaptation is considered to be a final outcome. 2. The initial insult causes a psychological disequilibrium that typically restabilizes over time. 3. Most individuals sequentially transition through time-limited stages by coming to terms psychologically with whatever trauma has occurred to them. 4. Although most individuals experience most stages, others may not. And 5. Not everyone transitions through all stages sequentially. Some individuals skip stages, some regress backwards to a previous stage, some can become stuck in a stage for long periods, while others may never reach the final adjustment stage. Next, 6, experiencing different stages separately and sequentially does not always occur, as some individuals may be observed to be in overlapping stages. Next, observations at each stage can be correlated with certain cognitions, emotions, and behaviors. And although stages are self-triggered, appropriate behavioral, psychosocial, and environmental interventions, such as counseling, can positively affect coping strategies to successfully transition towards adaptation. The 5 stages of adjustment to a sudden onset physical disability postulated by Livnay are: initial impact. In this first stage, generally involves an individual and often family reaction during the initial hours and days following a sudden and severe bodily trauma, such as a spinal cord injury, limb amputation, heart attack, or sudden onset of a life-threatening disease. 2 substages are commonly identified: shock and anxiety. Shock is described as a surreal experience in which thought processes are disorganized, disoriented, and confused, as many individuals in shock have difficulty concentrating and are unable to make simple decisions. Thought processes are disorganized, disoriented, and confused. Discussed that one already. That was a duplicate there. Anxiety is described as overwhelming and can trigger a panic attack or hysteria-like behavior in extreme reaction cases. Defense mobilization. This stage is characterized by 2 substages, bargaining and denial. Bargaining is described as a religious or spiritual attempt to negotiate with God or a higher power to be cured with the expectation of full recovery. In essence, the individual and often the family pray for survival and or recovery with a promise to pay penance for any past wrongdoing. In addition, in return for a cure or recovery, individuals may promise to donate to the church, do charitable work, and so forth. This bargaining is described as being a short-term process. Denial, the other one, is a longer-lasting process. Although bargain and denial are seen as overlapping, denial is viewed as a more extensive level of suppression or negation of the disability and its ramifications in order to maintain self-integrity. Next up is initial realization. The third stage. There are major substages: mourning and depression, and internalized anger. Mourning or grief is typically of shorter duration, where the individual grieves the loss of body function and the past way of life. Depression is generally longer and future-oriented, where cognitions involve fear of an often uncertain and perceived grim future. Suicidal ideation is sometimes present during this stage, as well as asking, "Why me?" There is the retaliation stage. It is the 4th standalone stage with no substages. So this refers to externalized hostility. This stage essentially involves rebelling against a perceived dependency. An individual has anger and is now projected onto the external world in the form of hostility toward other people, objects, or environmental conditions. The final adjustment or reintegration in this stage delineates a cognitive, affective, and behavioral component. So there's a cognitive reconciliation or acceptance of the disability and its permanency. A new disability self-concept is formed, and individuals seek to master their environment by problem solving. Persons who reach this stage are able to accept that they have a disability, they gain a new sense of self-concept, they reappraise life values and seek new meanings and goals. Emotionally, individuals are quote-unquote okay with their disability and can talk about it without becoming upset. Let's talk a little bit about somatopsychology. This field theory was postulated by Kurt Lewin in 1935 and 1936, centers around the belief that our self-concept or self-worth can and is affected by the feedback we perceive from interacting with others in our environment, referred to as our life space. Although the original theory did not include the impact of a disability and how that impacts our interaction, researchers have refined the hypothesis to include the impact of disability. The revised theory has been encompassed as the following. Behavior is a function of psychosocial variables such as self-esteem and coping skills. Organic factors related to the disability such as paralysis or blindness, and environment or physical access and attitudinal factors all mix into things. So specific to this theory arises the central question, how do persons with disabilities perceive themselves in Western society's mirror? A synopsis of historical attitudes in general would suggest many persons with disabilities have been stigmatized, discriminated against, persecuted, devalued, dehumanized, and essentially treated as minorities. Arguably, for individuals who possess a more internal locus of control, many of these negative experiences would potentially not have as demoralizing an emotional effect as for persons who have more external locus of control. So, does an individual that has emotional good well-being and good coping strategies, how do they view themselves within Western society? Are they able to take some of those variables discussed previously, looking at how their disability, such as paralysis or blindness, how that affects them and their ability to negotiate in the environment? And do they have an ability to accept and have come to terms with their disability and thus are able to cope and take ownership of what they need to do to function within society? Or does somebody give that up? Have they succumb? Do they not have good coping strategies? Do they not have acceptance of the disability? And thus, does that contribute to maladaptation? That they feel limited, that they feel excluded, and they are less adjusted overall. The most recent adaptation model to chronic illness and disability has shown to have promise, theoretically, empirically, and with positive clinical implications. So the disability centrality model, this was developed and built upon by Devins et al.'s 1983-1994 work, looking at the illness intrusiveness approach. So for the disability central model, Bishop describes 6 tenets as the theoretical underpinnings that factor in subjective and objective quality of life satisfaction and control over one's medical and environmental circumstances. These 6 tenets are the following. Impact of a chronic illness and disability can be measured by multi-dimension subjective quality of life measures. Quality of life is an individual's overall differences regarding which domains are more important to them. The onset of a chronic illness and disability results in an initial reduction in overall quality of life and centrally important satisfying activities, as well as feelings of personal control. The degree of quality of life reduced is dependent on how many central domains are affected. Individuals seek to maintain and maximize overall quality of life by minimizing gaps caused by chronic illness and disability. People strive to close these gaps by either changing their values and interests commensurate with their disabilities, employ strategies to increase perceived control over their health and environment, or alternatively, do nothing to improve or change their values. Okay, let's look at some ecological models. And let me go back. Sorry, I was interrupted there. In these models, there is the components of shock, anxiety, and denial, depression, internalized anger, externalized anger, and then later acknowledgement, acceptance, and adjustment. There is a few different ecological models. These take into account or look at the nature of the disability, the characteristics of the person, and environmental influences. So, nature of the disability. This factor explores aspects of the disability and the implications of each. So the first subfactor is time of onset, regarding whether an individual was born with a disability or acquires it at some later point in life. Another subfactor is the type of onset. This concerns whether or not the disability had a sudden impact and the implications of that. If it's a sudden impact like a spinal cord injury from a car accident, that would have a affect an individual potentially different than a prolonged onset, such as the development of multiple sclerosis. In the case of a sudden onset, perceived attribution of blame becomes a factor that influences adjustment. Functions impaired. This addresses the relative importance each of us place on our functional abilities. For example, some individuals are most terrified to lose their sight, while others fear becoming paralyzed or losing their hearing the most. And related to this is the significance these abilities play in our life. For example, an academic whose livelihood and intrinsic interests revolve around reading may be devastated by vision loss. However, researchers remind us that the insider perspective, whereby those persons who have lived and adapted to their disability emphatically disagree that it is the worst thing that they could lose. Unfortunately, many perceive any disability as tragedy and one that they are not certain that they could live with. Next, looking at visibility of a disability, this considers the reaction individuals with visible disabilities sometimes experience, for example, wheelchair users, such as discrimination, devaluation, and being ignored. Stability of the disability addresses whether the disability is stable and generally will not become worse versus those that have uncertain prognoses but progressively worsen over time. And pain. So pain now, it is a special category into itself addressing psychosocial adjustment. Unlike other things, chronic pain is a primary or secondary debilitating condition that can have a significant negative impact on an individual's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Cognitively, individuals can exhibit poor concentration and attention, suicidal ideation, and reduced problem-solving abilities. Emotions often include depression, feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, and despair. Now, looking at personal characteristics, these determining factors involve individualized traits or characteristics, gender. This looks at how gender differences are involved in coping with disability. There are or is some mixed feelings regarding which gender adjusts to a disability better. However, Western society expectations of each gender are clear. Males are supposed to be quote unquote rugged, independent breadwinners, stoic, athletic, dominant, and tough, whereas women are expected to be uh, beautiful in physical appearance, passive, homemakers, and good nurturers. These aren't my words. These are words by Sharmez, 1995, and Huang, 1997. Females and males with severe disabilities may not be able to live up to some of these expectations and may have difficulty adjusting to that if those were the roles that they had accepted or defined for themselves. Under personal characteristics, activities affected relates to the significance individuals place on their activities. A hockey player who becomes paralyzed and is no longer able to play sports may experience greater difficulty adjusting than a professor who has the same injury but can perform all their academic activities. Interest, values, and goals. This pertains to the differing passions people have in their lives. Those who proverbially put all their eggs in one basket or have few, if any, interests and lose the ability to engage in them likely find adjustment more stressful than those who have multiple interests. Remaining resources. Described by Vash and Crew, these are the abilities and traits as an individual retains regardless of his or her disability. These include intelligence, motivation, sense of humor, extroversion, social poise, resilience, emotional stability, and coping strategies, all which have been implicated in positive adjustment. And spiritual and philosophical base, this refers to one's spiritual or religious beliefs, particularly as to whether some people believe their disability is a punishment from a higher power, with the assumption that those who believe they are being punished have a more difficult time adjusting. Environmental influences, things that have an impact upon adaptation to disability. Family acceptance and support becomes significant in that if a disabled loved one is viewed as a contributing family member and not devalued, this generally correlates with a more positive adjustment to the disability. Income plays an important role, not so much as in overall happiness, but rather in quality of life. Once people have their basic needs met, there is relatively little difference in happiness ratings between those who are extremely wealthy and those of more modest means. However, a higher income and adequate health care availability positively impacts one's ability to remain healthy, as well as purchase necessary accommodations and equipment/devices for a better quality of life. Available community resources refers to support from local agencies, which could include things like the Veterans Affairs, client assistance programs, and centers for independent living. Individuals with severe disabilities who live in rural settings with no resources may not only have to travel long distances for appointments, but also be required to be away from home and family at times, and at times for several days, and that can be a big challenge. Looking at institutionalization. Nope, for social support. Social support is critical for positive adjustment and fostering self-esteem. So social support, obviously having that support from family and friends and the individual, if they're feeling supported, if they're feeling that love, feel like that they're able to take on the new challenges in their life. The positive social support believed to be a buffer against stress and an appropriate coping strategy and helps regulate negative emotions. Institutionalization becomes a concern for those persons with severe disabilities who are unable to physically take care of themselves, do not have the funding to hire an attendant, or have no family or friends who can perform a caregiving function. In such cases, individuals are faced with temporarily or permanently having to reside in a nursing home. Aside from most Americans not wanting to live in a nursing home, the U.S. General Accounting Office published a study in 2002 indicating approximately a 25% abuse rate, which either resulted in death or serious injury of nursing home residents nationwide. The forms of abuse include neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and malnourishment. Final thing we're going to look at here is the recurrent or integrated model of adjustment. The recurrent or integrated model of adjustment following an acquired disability was hypothesized essentially owing to a perceived shortcoming of the stage or linear model of disability. One of the several criticisms of the stage model was its theoretical emphasis likening the stages of grief over a deceased loved one to that of acquiring a disability. The main argument is that persons with acquired disabilities continue to live with their disability every day. Therefore, although the emotional upheaval subsides over time, those with acquired disabilities continue to periodically experience chronic sorrow throughout their lives. In this sense, there is never a final adjustment or adaptation stage where the disability no longer affects the individual. Pertinent to this model are several key concepts. Cognitive schema. This is our integrated beliefs and assumptions regarding ourselves, others, and how the environment works. When a sudden and traumatic disability occurs, many individuals attempt to cling on to the comfortable old schemas because of an overwhelming anxiety and uncertainty that the disability brings. This has been referred to as the as-if behavior, whereby individuals attempt to minimize anxiety by denying or distorting reality and pretending as if nothing has happened. As the old schema no longer adequately works and the individual begins to realize the implications of the disability, depression may set in. Positive new schema are formed when somebody with a traumatic disability can search and find meaning in the disability and in post-disability life, learn to master or control their environment and the disability and their future, and protect and enhance the self by incorporating the new disability identity. All right, so that's a review of some of the adaptation and adjustment theories. There are more in the chapter if you are interested in exploring them.